So I'm going to read a couple of lines that I saw from LinkedIn and the website, and maybe you can interpret them for me. So these are from the Molecule LinkedIn side of the website. So one on LinkedIn said, a decentralized biotech protocol porting intellectual property into Web3 and launching biotech DAOs.
And you didn't know what that meant right
what
off
does
the
that
bat?
mean? So it's funny because, and I do this on the podcast, I'll read a scientific abstract and then talk people through like, what does it mean in normal person language?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what does that mean in language that I can understand?
Honestly, it's good feedback, and we really need to level up our communication game, which is clearly pretty weak.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, no, I don't think it's weak, but I think, there's language that goes along with certain communities, right? And if you're not in that community, you may not immediately understand what the language means.
And I think what's super interesting, which is the point you're getting at, which is we have these two different user bases and audiences that we're catering to, right? And they speak completely different languages, right? And unless you're at the intersection of both, you won't understand what we do, which is our own fault for, not being able to speak across both sides. But, it makes sense, the question you're asking. So yeah, I would say like Molecule, the objective is to tokenize intellectual property. What that means is intellectual property is an asset, right? In the real world, it represents some sort of discovery that you contract with the government to protect, right? They say, we'll protect you for 20 years and you're the only person that can
typical what most people would just think of as a patent, right?
Totally.
And obviously there are other types of intellectual property, but the idea is you file a patent to protect this idea. And I mean, I guess essentially a patent is preventing other people from using your idea, but essentially that's the idea. So that's intellectual property.
Yep, exactly. So our the whole idea is to turn that intellectual property into cryptographic tokens. So what that means is right now, if I have a piece of IP and I want to license it to you, we have to get a lawyer in the room. The lawyer negotiates a license. We sign that, that licensing agreement. It's pretty expensive, kind of difficult.
Yeah.
And it creates friction to collaborating.
Yeah.
So if you and I want to collaborate, we have to get lawyers involved.
Right.
That's tough, right? It just makes it decreases the incentive for you and I to collaborate. Now, if we have assigned the intellectual property rights to, tokens, like crypto tokens, then us collaborating is as simple as me sending you tokens. And those tokens have a piece of the intellectual property rights of whatever it is we create. So yes, it can be a patent, but it can also be something as simple as like a, sponsored research agreement, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be what we call hard IP, like a patent. It can also be soft IP, right? Anything that's created from this collaboration, we're going to tokenize, and whatever we discover, any patents that come out of that are basically shared amongst whoever the token holders are of this. So, we may start off 50-50. We may want to get, another collaborator involved, send them some tokens as well. No lawyer is needed to enforce these rights. They're just enforced by the blockchain, essentially.
So okay. So let me kind of repeat back to you what I think I heard, and you can tell me what I got wrong. Okay. So let's just say a patent, because that's easy for, I think, anybody to understand. So there's a patent around a drug, right? So we find a drug in my lab, we file a patent on it through the university or whatever. We do it ourselves if it's a company. And then I think what you're saying is you create a token for that IP. There's a certain number of these coins that we're talking about here, a certain number of coins that represent all of the value of that IP today, right? And those can be distributed to as many people or entities as we want to. And the ownership of that IP is proportional to the percentage of the coins that you hold. Is that roughly accurate?
It's essentially accurate. I mean, if a lawyer was in the room, they would have.
I'm sure there's complications.
They would tear you apart for saying that, and they would tear me apart for saying you're right.
Okay,
but that's essentially it.
Okay, so now help me understand if somebody else comes along. So let's just take Aura Biomedical, right? So Aura, the Wormbot company. There's a drug. You and I and a few other people have all the tokens for this drug, right? And there's some IP around that. Aura finds that drug massively increases lifespan in worms, right? They want to do some experiments on that. How does this enable? So normally what they would have to do is enter into some sort of licensing agreement with the company who has the IP around that drug, go through this complicated, expensive, friction-filled process, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So now we've got these tokens. How does that make it easier?
Because you can sell some of them to fundraise, right? So rather than licensing the drug from the company, forming a company to hold that IP, now selling equity to investors to fundraise for that research, you can directly do it by selling tokens.
So that helps fund the additional research. I guess what I'm still not clear on is how does that help with the ownership of the IP or the licensing of the IP? So would some of that fundraising go to the company or people who had the original IP? How does that?
Yeah, so the fundraising would go to whatever the token holders want. So you basically I think one way to think about the tokens is their governance, basically. So, the same way you have corporate governance where, each person on the board has X% of the vote. The token holders are the shareholders, essentially, right? From a governance perspective. And so if they all vote, hey, we want to sell 10% of these off so that we can go fundraise for, we ran the worm bot experiment, but now we want to go test them on mice. It's going to cost this much money.
Okay.
We want to fundraise for that next milestone. You can do that essentially.
So this is so in what you're describing, this is an opportunity to raise funds to further develop the IP. I guess what's still not completely clear to me is how does it enable collaboration with a new entity like Aura is in the example that I gave, right?
Totally. So if Aura wanted to, if you think about the tokens just as a simplification, I'm not saying this is the case, but if you think about the tokens as representative of equity in the chemical, right, in the compound, and you wanted to share that with a collaborator and give them upside in the compound rather than any sort of other incentive, shares in the company or, cash.
Yeah.
This is a way to create aligned incentives around the development of that chemical.
So in this case, instead of a licensing agreement where Aura would get 5% of the future value of this thing, they would get a certain number of tokens that would have some proportional value to the total value of the IP.
Exactly. So I think the simple way of looking at it is like a cap table, like a capitalization table of a company, but for one specific IP asset.
Got it. And what's the benefit of blockchain over other ways of accounting for the asset, the tokens or whatever you want to call them, the pieces of the pie, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say there's no real innovation on the benefits of holding the token versus a piece of paper, right? And there's not meant to be an innovation there. The goal is to create a more seamless technology for value sharing and transfer of IP to make the transfer more seamless. The intrinsic value of the asset, the token, is not meant to be innovated upon, right? It's we're trying to basically recreate the IP system, but in a digital way, right? So the IP rights are the IP rights. So there's no innovation there.
Yeah.
But transferring those rights becomes a lot easier. And you have to start to think, okay, once the transferring of them becomes easier, what can you do with that? You can collaborate more. You can fundraise much easier. And so, very quickly, you can start to see how this whole system kind of overtakes the old IP system just because it's more efficient. You're applying less friction at every single point of value transfer. Where there was a lawyer in the middle that just created friction from collaboration or friction from fundraising, you've now removed that. So this system should have higher velocity because there's less friction.
I absolutely see the fundraising part. I don't want to get too far in the weeds on this topic, but I also want to make sure I understand it and hopefully other people do. We'll get to longevity. Don't worry. So I see the fundraising side. How does this help with the IP enforcement side? So in other words, who's going to be responsible for enforcing the IP if somebody else comes along who doesn't have any tokens and starts infringing on it?
Yeah. So, I mean, in the same way that a company would sue another company who's infringing on their patent rights, you have a bunch of token holders that all have an shared incentive for this IP to be enforced, and so could band together and fundraise for a lawsuit.
But they would have to band. I guess that's my question, right? Would be, because I guess what I'm immediately thinking is you're going to have maybe a large number of token holders. So you're going to have some sort of way for them to vote on whether they want to enforce the IP or not. I mean, am I understanding kind of correctly how this would work?
And the voting system and the governance systems with respect to tokens are super well established. There's a ton of platforms on every single blockchain, but all the major ones at least, that enable this token holder based governance where people can make proposals. The vote is you can engineer how the votes are calculated. So do you want it to be linear, right? It's where more, one token, one vote. Do you want it to be one person, one vote, right? Who holds?
Right.
So there's
Well,
lots
like
of different
Senate versus House of Representatives.
exactly.
Model. Yeah.
So you can have both if you want, and both have to agree.
But presumably you got to have that up front. In other words, you can't change the rules in the middle of the game.
Or you can change the rules as long as everyone agrees to change the rules. So it can be like an adaptive organism, so to speak, right? But yeah, no, 100%. You can't just rug pull them and change the rules in the middle.
And I mean, I think partly this is one of the concepts I wanted to talk about is there's a lot of skepticism, I think, out there about cryptocurrency in general, blockchain, given that I think certainly me and most people probably don't really understand what that means with any great depth. There's a lot of uncertainty. And, you hear about sort of horror stories. So how do you protect against that fear that I think a lot of people are going to have about this mechanism and ensure that, in fact, all the guardrails are there, everything's above board?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just going to be a continuous battle of trust, frankly. That needs to be earned because there are a lot of, non-trustworthy entities that have come before us that have tarnished the reputation of this incredible technology. The way I think about it is like, if what crypto is basically re-engineering the financial system. Scammers are going to try and scam it because there is an incentive to do so.
Right.
And so that is unfortunately what's happened. And unfortunately, it's tarnished the reputation of a very powerful technology. Right. And so over time, my hope is there are enough trustworthy entities. And I think the institutionalization of crypto that you're seeing now, the Bitcoin ETFs, now financial advisors can.
Right.
So.
Right. That'll help. Yeah.
It helps, right? It's not to say it's a cure, but it's certainly like a step forward.
Yeah.
So I think it's a continuous battle we have to fight. I think we're always going to be under the spotlight, and we have to just hold true to our values and be honest and open about everything we're doing. So there's absolutely zero sketchy business. And I think so long as we do that over time, we should build the trust, in a compounding way. But I don't think it's the kind of thing where if you're skeptical about crypto, we're just going to convince you to jump on this train. I think also another difficult part of our job that I think is super interesting is scientists by nature are skeptical.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, they should be.
Yeah, they should be, and they are, and it just makes it harder to convince them to switch over.
And I would say scientists in general don't have a lot of experience or understanding with crypto, right?
Totally.
The communities by and large don't overlap that much.
Totally. And the headlines don't do us any favors.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So can you point to any examples of really good outcomes with this model yet, or is it too early?
Yeah, so it's still very early, and I hate saying that because I want to see the progress so badly, but it's coming. And we've funded a few very interesting researchers who have built some assets that are now in everything's still preclinical. Nothing I would say is like a clinical phase assets. There are some.
And when you say you funded, how have those been? Are you able to talk about specific examples and how they've been funded? Like, what is the mechanism there?
Yeah. So one example is, I don't know if you're familiar with Victor Korolchuk. He studies autophagy at University of Newcastle.
Yeah.
We funded his lab to look for autophagy inducers. They have a screening platform that they think is fairly predictive of autophagy and induction and can pull out which compounds induce autophagy. And they have some evidence that some of the compounds that they're finding are more potent than rapamycin, which is super interesting. And so the way we fundraised for them was so Vita DAO, which is a DAO. Maybe best to not get into the details of what a DAO is, but
maybe it's worth just defining it in whatever level of depth you think is appropriate, but just so people kind of have an understanding of what the concept is.
Yeah, the way I think about it is it's like a nonprofit where all of the people that donate to the nonprofit get a say in where the funds go.
Okay.
So I think now if you participate in a nonprofit and you donate, you're trusting this board of people to allocate the money and hopefully do it, in the way that they're supposed to.
And just to be clear, when you say it's a nonprofit, is it a nonprofit recognized by the IRS as a nonprofit, or it's just an entity that doesn't have profit as its primary motivation, but it's not like a 501c3?
Yeah, the latter, because it's a DAO in and of itself is not a legal entity.
Got it.
Right? It is code, right? That's, is run on this world computer.
Okay.
So it doesn't have like legal standing intrinsically, but it may have a nonprofit like subsidiary agent, so to speak, right? That it signs contracts.
Got it.
Like that signs contracts on behalf of the DAO. But ultimately, like the token holders in the DAO, basically determine what the different agents who are legal entities
and
do.
Can anybody create a DAO? How do you create a DAO? Again, I didn't expect the conversation to go down this path, but I think these are questions that I don't know the answer to, and I'm guessing a lot of people don't.
100%. So it's quite simple. I mean, even Trump launched a coin, right?
Yeah.
So launching a cryptocurrency is probably too easy at this point.
So just again, to demonstrate my ignorance, is creating a DAO equivalent to launching a cryptocurrency, or are those separable?
They are separable. So a DAO is basically like...
What does DAO stand for? DAO.
It's a Decentralized Autonomous Organization.
Okay.
And so what's funny is the A in DAO is very rarely followed. It's not autonomous, right? So we're basically, typically, when people say DAOs, what they mean is you have a bunch of token holders who make decisions, and then you have a small group of people that effectuate those decisions. In an ideal world, you would have a piece of code that would just effectuate all those decisions.
Right.
In practicality,
you need some committee that acts on the wishes of the token holders when they vote. Yeah,
exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
So back to your earlier question of like, is a token the same as a DAO? Not necessarily, but you can make a DAO from any token.
Right. So again, let me repeat back to you what I think I heard, and you can tell me if I got it wrong. So the coin, the cryptocurrency, is a tool to enable you to have multiple stakeholders, and for them to have proportional control, voting rights or whatever, and to organize that. But in principle, you could do the same thing with an Excel spreadsheet that said, I have 5, you have 10, somebody else has 25 votes, and do it that way.
Totally. Except the only difference with the spreadsheet is that it would require trust. So I'm relying on Matt to not change my line item in the spreadsheet.
Right.
With this, there's no trust needed. We can be anonymous people on opposite sides of the world and still form a DAO and
assuming that you trust the blockchain technology, though, right? I think this is where a lot of the questions and concerns comes in, and a lot of people don't, or they don't, but they don't really know why they don't trust it. They just don't trust it, right? Because they've heard horror stories. So yeah, I think trust is required to some extent, regardless. But I think what you're saying is, if done properly, the technology is there to ensure that everything is accounted for and above board with the blockchain technology.
Well, I think the question of trust is a good one, right? And it's like, ultimately with any technology, you are trusting some entity, right? So even if you run a program that gets run on Amazon, you're trusting them to not take down.
You're absolutely right.
You're trusting them to not take down the service that they're offering you. So I'm not saying they're untrustworthy. Like they haven't screwed anybody, or that I know.
Depends on who you ask. There are lots of books out there that would argue against that. But I get what you're saying.
Yeah. But it's an important point. Like they can basically rug pull you, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that for all the people that distrust blockchain, I think the point is, it's not that it's completely absolved of any risk. The idea is that if you have a bunch of people who are all have a shared interest in the system being trustworthy, then you can basically trust that it will continue to be trustworthy, right?
Yeah. Okay. So I have a better understanding now of what a DAO is, for sure. And I get your meaning. I think, again, like you were saying, it's just going to take time for people to become comfortable with this technology, and I think certain organizations will gain credibility and trust, and then others won't. But I think I understand better now how you set up a DAO, how it's integrated with blockchain and crypto. I think. But we started this by talking about specific projects. So there's one specific project on autophagy and Vita DAO. So Vita DAO is a DAO.
Yes.
They have their own coin.
Yes.
And so that is used to fund projects.
Yes.
And so can you take us through, like, what does that mean? How is this one project funded to find new inhibitors of autophagy? And so how does that relate to, like, the IP around? I assume there's the IP around the screening system, the interaction with the university.
Totally.
How does that work?
Absolutely. And I'm gonna try to be careful to not bore your audience, but
well, I think it's part of how you build credibility is actually talking about this stuff so people can understand it. So yeah, we don't want to bore anybody, but
if they want to fast forward this part,
if my eyes start to go like this,
be careful. You think melatonin's strong? Just wait till you hear about IP tokenization. Okay. So VitaDAO, kind of like I said, is this nonprofit organization. They launch a governance token called Vita, right? And Vita basically says you get a proportional vote on how funds are deployed. So VitaDAO sold a bunch of those tokens, raised a treasury, and that treasury, is basically intended to fund longevity research, right? Various PIs or companies that they think are going to push forward their mission, which is to increase lifespan. So, basically the proposal came, should we fund Viktor Korolchuk to study and discover some autophagy inducers? And the vote was yes, we should do it. And so the amount of money, I think it was like $285,000, was sent to basically a legal entity. That legal entity off-ramped that crypto into basically fiat currency and wired it to the university. At the same time, from the university, they wrote a sponsored research agreement that said whatever Viktor finds, basically the rights go to the holders of this contract, which was that legal entity, right?
Yeah.
So they exchanged the fiat for the IP rights in the form of a sponsored research entity.
Right.
That legal entity then minted what we call an IP NFT. And what that means is an intellectual property, non-fungible token. It basically means there's one of one, right? And that one of one token is basically assigned the rights of that sponsored research agreement. So now you have a cryptographic token on the blockchain that whoever holds it now holds the rights to that sponsored research agreement.
And when you say one of one, what do you mean by that?
What I mean is there's only one of these tokens that will ever exist. It has a unique address. It's basically a unique identifier on the chain that represents now legally the rights to the research.
Got it. And is that token then proportionally owned by the holders of Vita tokens?
Yeah. So what happens is it's a one of one, right? But then that doesn't actually solve the problem that we were talking about earlier, which is like further fundraising and, shared governance, et cetera, over that one asset.
Yeah.
So you create a second token, and that second token it's a fungible token. So you can create 1 million of them, right?
I see.
And those 1 million tokens now co-govern that one that represents
the
IP
way
rights.
And that people could vote on what to do with that, depending on how many of those they hold. Okay.
In the same way that you have a single patent in a company, but lots of voting shares potentially. Right. That's kind of we have that kind of dual system as well.
Okay.
And so Viktor needed some more money for his research. So what they did was they took those 1 million tokens that were created. We called them Vita Fast because autophagy, fasting autophagy.
Okay, got it.
So that was the ticker, Vita Fast. And so we sold some of those Vita Fast tokens to buyers and said, hey, Viktor needs more money for his research. Right. We want to, basically decentralize the ownership and governance of this asset. Does anyone want to buy it? Raised some money, and now has further funded that research. So now those tokens trade on the open market too, right? So now you can go on any of the like crypto token screeners, and there's a market for these Vita Fast tokens. So now you have a researcher at a university who has a freely trading asset that represents their research.
But do they get any? They don't get any additional funding based on the trading of that token.
So it's actually interesting you say that. They do. So this kind of gets into a little bit of the financials of how this whole system works. But what VitaDAO does is they provide liquidity. So they provide both VitaFast tokens and stable coins like USDC. It's just basically like a tokenized version of the dollar.
Got it.
And they provide that to the market for trading. And when people trade, the small fee is taken, and some of that small fee can go to fund the research. So it can further fund the research just by the trading volume.
Does it in this case?
Yeah. And this is actually one of the most interesting pieces, I think, of this whole system, which is going back to your question of like, what is the benefit of doing any of this? There are markets for, trading crypto, right? Yeah. Those markets all, charge small fees.
Yeah.
You don't need to charge large fees. Like the fees that people are, used to paying are like sub 1%, right? But in the process, if you can create more engagement with the research and get people more involved and get excited about it, just the volume of trading alone can fund some of the research.
Right.
And that's what we're focused on specifically at Pump.Science, which is like a kind of a spinoff of Molecule, is seeing whether we can fund entire research programs with just the trading fees, no fundraising, so to speak.
Okay. So that's very helpful. Thank you. And I totally see the value of like opening up research funding to the open market. Are there what are some of the other projects that and first of all, what's the relationship between Molecule and VitaDAO?
So Molecule is a private company. It builds technology, this IP tokenization technology, to empower other groups like these DAOs, like VitaDAO.
Got it.
To use that technology to fund and tokenize and develop for certain specific research areas.
So Molecule itself doesn't directly fund research.
Correct. It builds the tools that enables groups like VitaDAO to use that technology and fundraise for whatever research their mission is.
Got it.
Around funding.
Got it. And so you mentioned Pump.Science. So let's talk about that. So that's a spin-off of Molecule.
Yeah,
can you tell us what that is and how it works?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things that we discovered as we were building out this entire DeSci system was the complexity. And I think you recognize that just by reading the Molecule site. And one of the most complex pieces is around this question of IP, which you brought up, which is like, people want to simplify it to the patent, but IP is this kind of amorphous thing. And that confused people, and it confused them into just like kind of walking away, throwing their hands up. I don't understand this, and walking away. So one of the thoughts with Pump.Science was, what if we just made one token, one intervention? So if you said, okay, rapamycin, that gets one token, resveratrol gets another token, and to just simplify the whole system. And then I think another place that we've struggled historically, especially if you look at our kind of target market in the crypto space, is the research that we were funding is highly complex. So like not everyone's going to understand Victor Krolchuk's screening platform for autophagy inducers, right? And he may produce some data and a cool looking PDF with some fancy graphs and try explaining that to someone who's not trained in science. And so you can fundraise from people, but are they going to understand what's coming out of that funding? Are they going to actually reap the benefits of understanding what their funding is actually going toward and what it's producing? Not necessarily. So I think one of the things that we thought about is, what is an experiment that anyone can understand, right? And for us, it was like animal alive, animal dead,
right?
Like the simplest, right? Everyone understands life and death. And so it's the simplest endpoint to fundraise to the widest possible audience, right? Because it's just the most accessible endpoint. And so it was kind of this combination of like simplifying the IP value proposition, simplifying the endpoint. And so that was kind of the genesis of Pump.Science, which is, let's simplify the entire system. And also, I think another thing we were trying to build off of is, in crypto, people are used to trading meme coins, which basically take extremely low fee. The reason I bring that up is because if you think of, a lot of people think of crypto as like a casino, right? Where you come into the casino, you bet, sometimes you win. The probabilities are that you're going to lose.
Right.
But I think what people don't necessarily appreciate about meme coins is how good the odds are, right? And the odds are getting better as the blockchains are getting more efficient. So what this means is your odds of winning at the casino are converging on 50%. And the reason I bring this specific piece up is because that's what people expect when they now enter the crypto markets trading coins, is they expect odds that are nearing 50%.
And by winning, what do you mean by winning? Just that if you sell at any given time, you'll come out ahead from where you started.
Exactly.
Because I think a lot of people in crypto think of winning as, becoming a billionaire.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's no way that can be 50%.
Yeah. I just mean expected value over one, just like literally not losing. Right. The redefine winning to not losing.
Right.
So people are really used to trading in an environment where the odds are nearing 1-to-1.
Got it.
So the thinking with Pump.Science is we have to kind of fit in with that paradigm, right? So this is what I mean when I say we're trying to fund research with just transaction fees, because that's basically the house.
Right.
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 It's that small transaction fee that's taken with each trade that it basically shifts the odds in the house's favor, so to speak. And our thinking is if the house can be the lab that's fundraising for the research. Right. How much research could we hypothetically
intuitively fund? That's very appealing. So let me again try to state what I think you described, and you can again tell me if I get it right or wrong. So first of all, we'll get into the details of like how are you going to test lifespan and all that stuff, but let's just say you're going to start with some animal. Let's just say mice. We're going to do longevity experiments in mice. Now, those take a long time. There are reasons why that might not be practical, but you do longevity experiments in mice. You can pick. We could do this in principle on any number of interventions. So let's just say we're going to do supplements. Lots of people are interested. Does this supplement extend lifespan? Okay, so we're gonna pick nicotinamide riboside, right? NAD precursor, and you create a nicotinamide riboside coin, right? It gets traded on this platform, and then every time somebody buys or sells, some fraction of that value goes to support the research to do the experiment.
Precisely.
Okay. What happens if you start the experiment and then there's not enough money coming in? I mean, this is one of the challenges with research, right? It costs a lot of money. So how do you deal with the possibility that you might get started and then there's not going to be enough revenue coming in to actually do the research?
It's a risk. I think I apologize for being facetious here, but I think that's seeing the glass half empty, right? At least you were able to fund, at least you started.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And so our objective is to continue that as long as we possibly can and keep it going, but it is a risk. Can't deny that.
So just off the top of my head, having walked in, the academic world for many years and now being out of academia, to me, this seems like would be a pretty tricky model right now to use in the context of a university research setting, right?
And why is that?
Well, typically they want sponsored research where you have a guarantee that you're going to have a budget for a year, 2 years.
So how could you hypothetically solve for that?
You'd have to have the money up front, I would think.
Or you can reduce the size of the sponsored research agreement, so to speak.
Sure.
Right.
But
significantly.
In principle, though, the academic PI can't do the work until the money's
there. Money up front. Absolutely.
Do the work.
And so this is why we've kind of pivoted from, at least with the Pump.Science model, the DAOs are still funding PIs universities.
Because they can fund the budget up front. And
they raised a huge treasury, so like they can afford it.
It also sounds like, though, with the DAO, while some of the friction has been removed, you still have, I mean, you're not going to get past this till the universities buy in. Yeah. You still have to deal with the university legal offices and have lawyers involved at that
super tough
side of stuff.
It's super tough.
That's going to be
and imagine, like, that's even difficult without crypto.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So again, I don't want to get too far in the weeds because I think there are ways that this model could be effectively utilized on the private or nonprofit side. I just think universities, and again, maybe I'm wrong, maybe some universities will lean into this sort of an approach, but my experience has been that university sponsored research offices are very, very bureaucratic.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, and the bureaucracy is tough when you're dealing with people who are trading quickly, where the velocity of money is fast, and so they're impatient, right? And so good luck trying to tell them, it's going to take 4 months to negotiate this. Like, they're not going to wait around.
Right, that's right. So when did Pump.Science launch?
We launched it in September. There was a crypto conference called Solana Breakpoint, and we had 2 weeks to build it, like a prototype. And so in 2 weeks, we built what was the first version.
Okay.
And we wanted some compounds to, like, basically, try out this tokenized model with. And, we went to Aura. We thought, so we can get to why Aura. I think that's a completely separate question, why we chose that model, rather than doing universities and sponsored research agreement there. Right. But once we decided that we were going to go with Aura, we went to them and said, what compounds data can we launch? And they said, well, let's do rifamycin and urolithin A. Right. Like, we have that data. We're comfortable sharing it with you. Try it out.
And that was kind of like just test it out, see how it goes. And I mean, just to be clear, it's my understanding that in that case, Aura did not get a percentage of the transaction fees. It's a different model, right? So
it was a prototype.
Yeah.
Honestly, what we wanted to find out, frankly, was, does anyone care?
Yeah.
Does anyone, like, is there even, like, every like in entrepreneurship and in crypto, whatever, everything's an experiment, right? And so, like, I think our experiment, the hypothesis we had was people would find this type of research understandable and interesting to, basically buy tokens in.
Right.
And so that was the hypothesis. Both tokens, Riff and Euro, hit about $1 million market cap. So that was basically, like, to us, we were, it was above our expectations.
Yeah.
And it, basically, like, convinced us to invest further into the model.
And so when you say they hit about $1 million market cap, what that means is that the cumulative value of all the tokens for that drug totals $1 million, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And what did it start at?
It started at 5,000 market cap.
Okay, so that was pretty.
And
pretty
we didn't buy any tokens, so that it was all basically community fundraising.
And Aura didn't have any
or had no
either.
financial stake. We had no financial stake. We just launched it into the world at $5,000 market cap, and it hit $1 million within the night.
Cool.
So, and then after the worm experiments were done, we didn't honestly have, like, a strong plan of what to do after. We had this one.
Go out and see what happens. Yeah.
Honestly.
Yeah.
And we were like, okay, what do we do next? Let's do flies.
Yeah.
And so we started prepping the tech for fly experiments.
Right.
And then things really went nuclear. They went properly nuclear.
Yeah.
So we launched the fly experiments, and then combined market cap of the two tokens hit 400 million.
Wow. So what's next?
Mice. Mice experiments start on Friday.
Really?
So we actually didn't wait for the fly experiments to finish, because the urolithin A flies are just living too long. I think there's still 3 of them that are still alive. We launched those beginning of November, and the flies are still alive. They're the only ones left, are the ones that took urolithin A. But we didn't wait. The metric that we use to determine whether to advance a compound is maximum lifespan.
Mm-hmm.
So we wait for 90% of the animals to die and see if there's an enrichment in drug versus control. Both rifamycin and urolithin A passed that bar, and so we advanced them to mice. The question with mice, and maybe we should get into, like, kind of how we determine what experiments to run, but our thinking is very much around the experiments for longevity have to be fast. They have to be affordable, and they have to be entertaining, right? Because if any one of those 3 components is missing, the whole system does not work.
Well, I would add they also need to be scientifically
valid.
That's right. Or at least informative.
Informative.
Right? Yeah.
Apologies. That's clearly.
Well, I mean, I know you know that, but I think, those things aren't mutually exclusive, but it gets harder and harder and harder to be scientifically valid and informative if you're trying to be cheap and trying to go fast.
Of course,
right?
Of course, or entertaining.
Yeah.
You're 100% right. Yeah, definitely an important pillar, right? And so what we thought would work, and what we think will work, and what we're about to launch is rotarod testing. So basically, it's a surrogate for VO2 max in a human, you could argue. And I think from all, general understanding of geroscience, endurance is very much tied to lifespan. And so rather than, give the mice over a couple years and see whether it extends their life, like the ITP, right? Which is, requires nonprofit funding in large quantities and a lot of time and money to invest into, can we run quick rotarod tests and see whether the compounds improve rotarod performance, which is basically, for those who don't know, a rotarod test is basically you put a bunch of mice on a metal rotating rod, and it accelerates, and you basically try and see when they fall off.
Yeah.
Right. And then you measure when they fall off, and that's supposed to be a surrogate for their endurance. It's like a combination of endurance and strength that you're measuring.
Right.
And so, some people would probably argue it's a health span metric, but we know that these things are tied and correlated.
I mean, it definitely is a health span metric. I think, there's no right or wrong, right? You have to kind of pick something.
Exactly.
I see the rationale, it's probably a longer discussion about, there are plenty of different ways you could approach it. I see the logic. I think time will tell if it's actually a reasonable predictor for anything other than rotarod performance.
For sure. We'll see. And, we would love to incorporate more tests and experiment there, right? Like, ultimately, this whole protocol of, starting from the C. elegans lifespan to fly lifespan to rotorod. These are decisions that we made that we're certainly not beholden to.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, you can evolve as time goes. I mean, I think, it would be nice if there was a path to actually doing the definitive experiments. But again, maybe there are other options for fundraising down the road, right? If there's something looks very, very promising. I guess my only concern with the current approach is it's an unknown whether, first of all, what the sensitivity and specificity of rotorod is, right?
Yeah.
And this takes, and again, I don't want to get into like who's doing the work, where's it being done. There's a lot of people out there who aren't very good at mouse experiments, so be careful would be my advice.
What mouse model? What's the mouse model that we should be doing?
Well, I don't know that there is a right answer to that, especially if you're doing rotorod. What I'm getting at is there's a lot of mouse data in the longevity literature that has not been reproducible.
Sure.
And I think many of us have opinions as to why it hasn't been reproducible.
Yeah.
Some of it has to do with the labs that the work is being done in. And
I totally understand. Just bringing back to like your own words of like run the definitive experiment. I would challenge you to say like what even is that definitive experiment?
Well, I think right now the gold standard has to be lifespan with some healthspan metrics done in parallel. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at this point, I think unless you want to make a jump to companion animals or going right to human clinical trials, I think if you've got worm data and fly data, you still want to fill in that gap. You could make a legitimate case that comprehensive health span assessments in aged animals is as good as lifespan. We could have a debate about that. I actually am somewhere in the middle. Like I see the rationale, and I would feel pretty good if you had a drug and you could show you start at 20-month-old mice, 24-month-old mice over a 6-month period, you have maintenance or even improvements in multiple health span metrics.
Yep.
That's enough to move on.
Yeah.
You don't have to have the lifespan. I would not go personally right now just off rotorod. That's my personal sort of intuition about rotorod and what it means.
Yes, and all of these are debatable, and the ultimate metric, to me, the definitive experiment is human lifespan, right? And all of these are meant to be predictors.
Right, but we're not going to get there in any reasonable time frame. Lifespan? No, we're not going to get there.
Yeah. No, I totally agree.
But we can certainly do functional assessments in humans.
Absolutely.
And we can do lifespan in companion animals. So that's all doable in a pretty reasonable time frame. It's just resource allocation that has been the problem to date.
Exactly. And if there's anything that crypto can innovate on, it's resource allocation, right?
Right.
I think that's the important point.
Right. Okay, so this is kind of early days, figuring it out. I think this is a totally reasonable sort of approach. So how are the mouse experiments being funded in this first out of the gate model?
Yeah, so because the first two compounds, rifampicin and urolithin A, were not basically built into the protocol which we have now built.
There's no transaction fee going to fund the research.
Exactly. Yeah. So because they weren't built into that system, we're self-funding.
Okay, got it.
So, but we're about to launch 20 compounds that were all part of it was called the Longevity Prize. It was funded by VitaDAO.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so those will be part of the protocol that we're launching that will capture the transaction fees that will fund the research. But yeah, these mouse experiments we're self-funding.
And so in principle, there's no real limit to the number of interventions that could be tested, the number of coins that could be created. Is there a way to incentivize picking things that actually have a positive effect?
It's a great question. So we're building that specifically into our protocol. So whenever every new token gets launched on Pump.Science, 5% is basically allocated to the token holders in the highest performing compound. So basically we have an incentive mechanism to reward.
So say that again. I don't quite understand what you mean.
So at the moment, rifampicin is like the largest or the best life extending compound in C. elegans on our platform. It beat Euro. There's only two.
Right.
So Rif is the winner, but between the two on worms, in flies, urolithin A is likely to be the winner. I mean, the experiment's not over, but it's already decided. So urolithin A is the longest life extender of any compound on the platform in flies. So 5% of the tokens of new tokens that are launched are going to be issued 50-50 to the holders of RIF and the holders of Euro tokens.
Got it.
So basically, whoever holds tokens in the compound that extends life the most in each animal gets rewarded in future tokens that are launched on the platform.
I see. Okay.
So that's how we've, so this whole area is called mechanism design. It's basically like game theory plus economics. It's a super interesting area. It's one where honestly crypto's innovating quite a bit, but we think it's super important to incentivize people for the right things. To us, the right things are submitting compounds and getting them funded and tested that extend lifespan, right? And so we want to reward the people that do the behavior we want.
I think I think that's great. I mean, I think, my only thought would be, do you want to limit it like to the one thing that had the best effect, which is maybe, again, there are lots of ways you could do it.
There's design space here, but at least there's design space that we can start to play around with and see what actually generates the outcomes we want, right? But there is like a toolkit here to start to get people to play a game where the game is extend life, right?
I mean, again, I know this is probably a difficult question to answer quantitatively, but ballpark, like how much realistically could be obtained to fund the research through this sort of a model for a given compound, right? Even like what you're thinking the fraction might be for these transaction fees.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, the projections that you can use are Riff and Euro, which are the first two compounds that we launched, which have generated, I haven't checked the numbers in the past few weeks, but last time I checked, it was $7 billion in volume.
Wow. So
7 billion times 0.0025, it's 0.25%. I think it's puts you somewhere in the ballpark of like 200 million.
Wow. That's a pretty significant
that math could be wrong, but
resource allocation. Yeah.
No kidding.
So okay, so and then again, we don't need to get into too much of the details, but I presume some fraction of that could go back to the researchers to carry on the funding or to support mouse studies. And
exactly.
I mean, again, even if you could raise, a few 100,000, that's enough to do a legitimate mouse experiment, right?
Totally. And we're trying to be conservative in our estimates and start small. And so like we'd love to scale up to full lifespan experiments. I've already reached out to Rich Miller several times. You won't respond to my email. It's okay.
Rich, come on now. I know Rich pretty well.
Yeah, there's probably crypto somewhere in my email signature scaring him away.
My only advice would be, be thoughtful about the way the mouse experiments are set up. And I think if it doesn't have to be the interventions testing program, but if it can be done through sort of, disinterested third parties to the extent, I mean, we're all invested, right? But, somebody who doesn't have a real financial interest in the outcome, that's one of the beauties of the ITP, right? Is that, they don't care what works and what doesn't work, doesn't affect their careers, it doesn't affect their grants. Yeah, exactly. So I think if that's possible, then I think that's kind of people who know what they're doing and aren't going to be super biased to get a certain outcome will have a lot more credibility, broadly speaking.
And I think for all the reasons you just said are the reasons why we want to do it with the ITP, right? Because like the whole longevity community has definitely rallied around this program. And so it's one we want to be a part of because if it's what everyone is
and the structure's there, right? The built-in triplicate replication, like all of that for all of the challenge. I mean, there have been some challenges with the ITP, but in general, it is the gold standard for these kinds of studies.
So, I mean, if there's a dollar amount that we need to raise in order to get a compound submitted, like we will figure out how to do that. But we're going to start small. Rotarod tests on aged mice. It's a functional test. It's a single data point. It's not perfect, but it's still expensive and it's still valuable. So we're going to start there, and we would, hopefully we have the opportunity to iterate. Okay,
cool. So when can we expect these 20 to be launched? Do you have a target date?
We do have a target date. Our target date's February 8th. We're in the final processes, mostly on the technical side of things, just making sure that all of the...
So did you say February 8th?
Yeah, February 8th.
That's coming up fast.
Coming up fast. Yeah, I mean, crypto, you have to move very quickly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this is going to be on the Pump.Science website? Okay, I got to ask you, like, why do all these websites look like, some cyberpunk video game kind of feel?
It's a great question. It's a great question. I think you have to look at like who the audience really is, right? And the audience is not a bunch of Matt Kaeberleins. Like if it was, we would have branded it very differently.
I might like the cyberpunk video game feel.
Maybe you will, but I haven't seen you in any of our Telegram chats. So
okay, fair enough.
If you hop in, happy to change the branding. But I think really,
I guess the question would be, does that potentially limit the audience that you may be able to bring to the table?
Potentially, but I think that there's a lot to be said for that, of like finding your target audience and really building for them. And then, if your target audience changes, then adapting the system for, more different audience.
Give people what they expect to see, I guess.
Give people what they expect to see. And so this is the design pattern that people are used to seeing in our space. And so it may not be what you're used to seeing, but chances are you wouldn't have used the platform in the first place. So I think, frankly, this is actually where we've gotten things wrong in the past in DeSci, is like trying to be very professional, attract scientists. And what we end up coming off as is corporate to all of the people who are actually going to get this whole engine moving, right? And so I think another big piece of Pump.Science is, the branding is completely different to like what you'll see on Molecule's website, which is extremely professional and corporate, right? But I think what's interesting is like, the branding is trying to be corporate, or is trying to be professional. The scientists are like, this is too sketchy, it's crypto. The people that are, the crypto traders are like, this is too corporate. So like, it's very difficult to find the true target market. And we're trying to do that with the classic crypto traders. And this is the design they expect.
Okay.
And,
and I hope I didn't offend anybody with that.
Zero offense taken.
Comment, but
it's something that we would love to get to a situation where we have institutional money on Pump.Science.
Yeah.
But until then,
sure,
we can't expect.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the only thought I have is it's clear that there's still a pretty big divide between these worlds. And so over time, I'm sure that will change and the things will get closer. But I feel like still, there's work to be done, maybe to increase confidence on both sides.
Definitely. I think maybe one way to think about this is many of the crypto traders are going to be the ones to get the engine going, right? They're going to create, hopefully, a bunch of super valuable data on a ton of different compounds, right? Once that data has been generated, it's going to be much easier to attract a lot of the skeptical scientists who otherwise would have stayed away.
Yeah,
right?
I'm not even really thinking about the scientists. I'm thinking more about the maybe broader public that is interested in the space and potentially supporting these kinds of projects. And again, maybe that's fine. Again, maybe podcasts like this can help with that, right? But I mean, like, I'm personally interested in this model, right? For all of the reasons we've talked about, the idea that, it can engage a broader community in supporting important research. So I don't know that I don't know that you really care if the scientists are going to come to Pump.Science and, trade intervention coins. But certainly I think you want as broad an audience as you can get, right, participating. So that's I guess just what I'm wondering. I don't have any answers. I'm just saying what I'm thinking, right?
It's a subjective product question. And I mean, I think the answer really is in the market. Like who's going to move the market? Is it the average person?
Maybe not. Yeah.
I think that's the answer. And that's why we've designed like how we have. And, if we get to a point where, people think of crypto legitimately enough, right? Because we're also fighting that battle too, right? And so it's, twice as difficult to fight two problems at the same time. Fight the crypto problem and fight the longevity, like scientific challenge that we're trying to fight as well. So would rather use the people that are already trading, redirect some of that energy from meme coins into this, impactful research. And then, once we've generated some valuable data, maybe we can get the attention of the broader public.
So one more specific question for you about this model. Will it be transparent to people how much of the fee is going to research?
So this is honestly one of the best parts about cryptocurrency and blockchain that people don't really realize, which is I think people think of crypto as like a way to do illicit transactions. But what they don't realize is that everything on the blockchain is public, right? It's a public ledger, right? Every time,
even the transaction fees,
okay. Everything, like down to the, like decimal place, is all publicly recorded. You can see which accounts hold what assets, who's getting what. It's all there for anyone to see for free. It's
how do you see that?
you go onto, they're called block explorers. You can so every single transaction gets its own identifier. You can search up that identifier and see, okay, this account transferred this much of this coin to that account, and they did it on this date at this time. Like it's all incredibly transparent. It's basically like an auditor's, dream, right? It's everything out there for everyone to see. There's nowhere to hide.
Yeah.
There's nowhere to hide.
So I guess what I'm asking though is, I mean, that's great, but most people aren't going to know how to go find that. I wouldn't. So is it going to be clear on the Pump.Science website, like X% of all transaction fees is going to go? I mean, to me, that seems like something you would want to amplify, right?
Absolutely. So the way we've designed the system right now, the protocol, is 75% of all fees will go to the research.
Fantastic. That seems more than fair to me.
Agreed. I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so. Well, let's see if other people agree. But that's kind of what we've decided.
Great. Okay. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much. Anything we haven't talked about that you want to talk about?
Well, I mean, like I was listening to your guys' roundtable that you guys had on Atia's podcast, and I find it super interesting that you guys talk about all of the funding issues, and Rich Miller complaining that there isn't sufficient funding going toward the ITP, which is super fair. I think everything that you guys are saying, and I think everything you are observing with the issues of the bureaucracy in terms of like resource allocation is so fair. I think rather than like modify the beast, I think one interesting perspective to try is this completely new funding paradigm where it's individual based, right? So I think if you want to break down funding broadly, it's the public sector, the private sector, and individuals, right? The public sector is clearly failing. The NIH is not getting it, nearly as much funding from the NIH as it should. The private sector is just not allocating resources toward longevity research. They want people they want companies who develop a drug for a specific indication, end of life, chronic disease, where they can charge insurance a ton of money for it. And that is just the capitalist incentive that exists. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but you can't
expect the system is incentivized for poor returns. But yes, nobody's doing anything wrong. It's that the system is set up for incremental advances that are inefficient.
Exactly. And so shouldn't we be allowed to experiment with, the third end of the triangle, which is individuals? And there is no more efficient system for capital formation, resource allocation than crypto. It's just so easy. I don't need to wait 2 days for my bank wire to hit yours and, to have an Excel spreadsheet and all of these things. It's completely transparent on the internet, native to the internet, right? This ability to resource allocate from individuals. And if they decide that longevity research is important and worth funding, then take it directly from them.
I think the key is going to be helping people understand, how the funding is actually going to the research, what they're funding, and then, as we've already talked about, helping people get comfortable with the technology, right? That everything's above board, that it's not a scam. Right?
Absolutely. And I think that one of the ways we'll hopefully make strides with that is just by abstracting it all away.
Yeah.
There's almost like a part of me that says, no one really needs to know, right? Not to say that you want to hide it, but rather if you can abstract it away and it just becomes familiar, then, it almost doesn't matter what technology is happening on the back end, right? It's just, you put in dollars from your bank account and you get out, longevity medicines.
Yeah. And the reality is, if then people see that the research moves forward and goes up the ladder to mice and eventually into humans, at the end of the day, that's what we're all interested in. And so I think actually seeing, it's too early so far, but actually seeing some progress as things move forward will help gain confidence that the system's working the way it's supposed to. So
totally. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff we could also talk about. I know you're probably strapped for time. Definitely don't want to.
This has been super fun. I think it's been helpful for me. I think it'll be helpful for our audience, and I'm really looking forward to see what happens with the next 20 interventions. I hoping for big things, and we're gonna get some successes, some wins on the board.
Yeah, no, appreciate it, and appreciate all the collaboration that you and the ORD team have had with us as well. I know it's certainly questionable to be diving into this whole new world, and just appreciate you guys taking a risk on us, and we'll do our best.
Yeah, well, we're looking for big things. Awesome. All right, thanks so much, Benji. As always, thank you for watching. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them below. If you're not yet a subscriber, hit that button, and we'll see you next time on the Optispan podcast.